Today we shall take a look at Joseph Conrad's novella, The Heart of Darkness. Now, Joseph Conrad was born Joseph Theodore Conrad Korzeniowski. The name is a mouthful. He was a Polish English writer, and even as a young boy, he had been fascinated by the sea and he wanted to become a seaman. He often used to spend his early years, gazing into a map, and he saw the snaky coils of a river, and there were places which were like blank spaces, and somehow he had a fascination to travel to those places. And so this sort of formed a background to the novel. Joseph Conrad became second in command on a steamboat which would travel to the Congo basin. It would travel up the Congo River. And so he went to that land. He witnessed many things which shocked and horrified him. And then he returned to Europe, and this novella, The Heart of Darkness, followed as a result of everything that he had personally witnessed. Now, this novella, The Heart of Darkness, first appeared in the Blackwoods magazine somewhere in 1899 in 3 parts. It appeared as a serial in 3 parts, and later in 1902 it appeared as a full-fledged novella in a volume titled Youth with 2 other stories. So now this story, this novella, Heart of Darkness, has a frame story. It has an outer story, and that outer story has a character called Marlowe. Now, he's the protagonist, he's the narrator, and this man Marlowe is, he's sitting in a steamboat with some other sailors. There are 4 of them, and the boat is anchored. And Marlowe begins telling the other sailors his own personal story, the story of how he went to that Congo basin, he went up the Congo River, and what his own experiences were. So Marlowe is the narrator, and he tells the others that he had an aunt who helped him to get a position on a steamboat, and he was second in command. Now, the person who was actually the captain, he fell ill, and so Marlowe takes over. And he has to now take that steamboat right up the Congo River. Now, Marlowe goes up to the outer station of this African region, and he gets to see many strange things. For instance, he gets to see the pitiable condition of the natives there and how they have been treated like savages. There is a railroad under construction, and in order to construct that railroad, a lot of explosive substances used, and all those rocks and boulders have to be done away with It's a very, very dangerous scene, and many of these African people, they become, diseased, they are starving, and they are left to die, and nobody is bothered about them. So Marlowe witnesses all this. He reaches one point. It's a very arduous kind of a journey. He reaches one point, and from this one point he has to travel another 320 kilometers. So he takes another steamboat, and then he will reach that outer station where he will meet the accountant of the company, somebody who's impeccably dressed, in European clothes, and his accent is perfect, and it appears as if he's not affected by, this African influence and this native influence. And he and Marlowe begin a conversation, and Marlowe gets to hear of a man called Mr. Kurtz. Now this Mr. Kurtz is the antagonist, and Marlowe will have to go and meet this Mr. Kurtz, and people give their own impressions of Mr. Kurtz to Marlowe. For instance, this accountant has high words of praise, and he says that this man is going to go very far, and he sends in ivory of such large quantities, all the other people, all the other Europeans put together, Kurtz is able to get more ivory than all those people put together. So now ivory and rubber are two things that the Europeans want from Africa. So Africa is a savage land. That is what the impression is in the novella, because of the kind of things that are described. Yet it is a veritable treasure house. And so he has to make this trip to Mr. Kurtz, and it's a very difficult journey. He will somehow manage to go there. And when he finally meets Mr. Kurtz, it's almost nearing the end of the novel when that happens. When he finally gets to meet Mr. Kurtz, he realizes that this man is almost insane. Something has happened to him and he's not well. Everyone has been saying that Mr. Kurtz has mysteriously gone silent, and somebody needs to go and check on him and what has happened. And now Marlowe is here to do that. And he meets Mr. Kurtz, and Mr. Kurtz, there is no clear opinion about what he really is. He gives the impression of being an artist or a painter of some kind. He has drawn a beautiful sketch of a girl, and her face is sort of bound, and she's carrying a torch in her hand. The painting is there. She's a beautiful girl. And there are other reports about Mr. Kurtz. Finally, what we come to know is that Mr. Kurtz is on the verge of dying. And Mr. Kurtz hands over a packet of letters, a photograph, and a report of some kind to Marlowe. It's a report that he had been commissioned to prepare in order to, suppress savagery. So there is a society for the prevention of savage acts and for the, good of these so-called savages. Savage customs and all these things have to be curtailed. And Kurtz has been commissioned to prepare that report. And as a postscript to that report, Kurtz has written, "Exterminate all of them." So now that whole packet of letters and this report and the photograph, the photograph and the letters need to go to Kurtz's fiancée. He says, she's my intended. So go and give this to her. So all this is there. And then Kurtz also tells Marlowe that this thing shouldn't go. It shouldn't find its way to the hands of the manager. Make sure of that. So now, a short while later, the manager's boy will come and announce, Mr. Kurtz, he's dead. But a short while before Kurtz's death, Marlowe is sitting in his presence. He's sitting with Mr. Kurtz and he hears a whisper, the horror, and he can make nothing of it. He doesn't know what this means. But he has heard these, the horror. These are Kurtz's last words. And then the next thing we come to know is that the manager's boy comes and announces that Mr. Kurtz, he's dead. Now, T.S. Eliot has used this, Mr. Kurtz, he's dead. He has used this as an epigraph to his poem, The Hollow Men. So now, Marlowe has to make his way back to Europe. And he comes back to Europe and there are plenty of people who come to visit him and they all seem to be asking for some document of great importance, and Marlowe makes sure that he gives them all the wrong things that will be of no interest to them, but he doesn't give them that report. Finally, Marlowe hands over that report after removing that postscript. He hands over the report to a journalist and he tells the journalist, you do what you like with it. If you think it is fit to be published, you do it. He hands it over. And then he takes the packet of letters and the photograph and he goes to look for Kurtz's fiancée and he goes there. She is still in mourning. She's in black. Her whole face is contorted with grief, even though it's almost a year now after Kurtz's death. But if one would look at her face, it appears as if Kurtz died just yesterday. And she speaks in a heavy voice and she asks Marlowe to sit down and to tell her something about Kurtz's last moments. And she asks him, what did he say? When he was taking his last breath, what did he say? And Marlowe doesn't have the heart to tell her the exact words. He can't repeat the words, the horror. So he looks at her gently and he tells her, he took your name. And the girl is very relieved and she feels as if, she has just heard what she was all along waiting to hear. So this in brief is the story of this novella. But the novella is asking some questions. Who is the savage really? That's a very sharp question. Who is the savage? Is that African community, is that the savage community? Or are the perpetrators savage? Because they do all kinds of things and they heap all kinds of atrocities on those others. So who are the savages really? The suggestion is that perhaps each one of us is a savage at heart. And sometimes advanced civilizations forget that line, They're not sure of where to draw the line. In the name of improving the other, taking the other under their wing, whatever, they cross all limits. And then it does not remain a matter of civilizing the other. It becomes simple criminality. So the beast in them is let loose. This is a novella. It's not really so much about racism, the blacks. Yes, there are several references to that. You hear Joseph Conrad speak of the blacks, and the blacks, it goes on. But that is not really the point. The point is not that of racism. It is more of the West looking at the West. The Western civilization looking at what the Western civilization has ended up doing in the name of, that noble cause. So they are going for that noble cause. And they are the pilgrims who are setting out to do all this. But what do they really end up doing is a question which this novella poses. The horror. What is that? Towards the end of his life, whatever may have been Kurtz's intentions when he came here and he started his work, somewhere after living here for so many years, that journey into the heart of darkness, that journey into the interiors of this African region has become really a journey into his own soul, and he's able to look at himself and he's able to see himself for what he is, and he doesn't like what he gets to see, because he can see, how he began, how greed starts the whole thing off, and how then it goes on to bestiality, and then how to criminality, and then what all happens, how he has fallen in his own eyes is, implied in those words, the horror. So Mr. Kurtz has got to look into his own soul, and it's going to kill him to see his real truth. So also for Marlowe, it is not merely a journey into the heart of darkness, it is a journey into the depths of his very soul. Now, several people have made some critical comments about this novella. Edward Said, the well-known critic, he used the phrase, the scramble for Africa. What is this scramble for Africa? Actually, towards the close of the 19th century, we come across atrocities and brutalities that we would perhaps never have dreamed of. We cannot forget the genocide that's going to happen, and all the shape that it will take. And so that is implied here. So there was this King Leopold II of Belgium, and he was a very, very greedy man, and he wanted to conquer this Congo region because he wanted ivory and he wanted rubber, and so he sent men on steamboats to this place, and they did all kinds of things. They went to the extent of kidnapping women, keeping them under their control till their husbands were able to gather sufficient quantities of rubber. And so all these atrocities are implied here. So it is really a question of seeing what all we do in the name of civilizing the other. So the natives have their own culture, they have their own language, they have everything. But in the name of imperialism, the European culture begins to view itself as superior. It begins to view these natives as inferior, the other, the inferior, and then what they end up doing, they view the other as savage, and they view the other as a civilization which needs to be tamed, because that kind of savagery cannot continue. and then the Western civilization turns savage in trying to civilize the other. Now, the Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe has had a lot to say about this novella. He doesn't think that this novella allows the Westerner to look at his own face in the mirror of this novella. In fact, he says that Joseph Conrad had no knowledge about Africa or about the people he met, and so he had no business to write all these things. So he disapproves of this novella. We have to remember that Joseph Conrad was a Polish English writer, and English is his third language, in fact. So Polish, French, and then English. So the language of the novella is a little labored at places, but on the whole, it is a work which we could look at as an inquiry into our own selves.